I had the opportunity to watch several videos on YouTube of people, primarily the so-called black male and female, that gave their reasons on why they are no longer Christians or why they are no longer a part of the black church, why they don't believe in God. But it's quite interesting that black people are quick to forget the good things that was brought to them by way of the black church or black preachers. I've heard quite a few so-called black people bash the black church. They bash the Bible, and they bash the black preacher. Complete and total disrespect of preachers, but they forget when the preacher had to visit someone that was sick, your mother, your grandmother, or grandfather, or father, even you, when you were sick and at the point of death, and you were faithful in attending church, and you fell into hard times, you never failed to call the preacher to help and aid you. You forget about the time that your sons or your daughters got into trouble with the law, and you called the preacher, and he went to court and represented your son in front of that white judge, and because of the fact that he was clergy, or the judge had respect for that black preacher, that he was aware and knew of the service and works that he was doing in the black communities, he released your son or your daughters in the hands of the preacher. You forget about the many nights that you called upon that preacher to pray for you or to even counsel you or your children. He got out of the bed, left his family to come to your aid. You forget about that. You forget about the food programs. When you were hungry, when you were strung out on drugs, and you were about to lose your life, the preacher was there to set you back on the right track. I personally know of situations where a young man was a drug dealer, involved in gang violence, and he was shot down in the streets. And a preacher happened to come to the hospital, and he was making his rounds, because yes, preachers do go to hospitals to visit. See, there's a lot that people don't know about the preachers in the black communities. Not every preacher is a wolf in sheep clothing. There are preachers out there that's not about the dollar. Of course, you need money to keep that church functioning. And people, for whatever reason, do not like to support the church. You have no problems going to the clubs. You have no problems paying monies, fellas, for prostitutions. But when it comes to the church, you have an issue with that. The Bible says a workman is worthy of his hire. If that preacher can get up out of his bed at wee hours of the night to counsel you, to pray for you, to get your kids out of jail, to visit you when you're sick and pray for you, and plead your case in court, and even save your life. I know this man that almost lost his life and a preacher came. And by the time that preacher finished praying with that young man, to this day, that young man is a preacher. And he's got a testimony. But it's quite interesting that a lot of people that bash the preacher or bash the church are people that were at one time helped by a preacher, saved by a preacher, delivered from your mess through a preacher. But then the devil came and whispered in your ear and started feeding poison to your mind about how the preacher is not telling you the truth, about how the preacher is pimps in the pulpit, about how the preacher is sleeping with the women in the church, about how preachers just want your money. He's driving around in a nice car, living in a nice house, and yet you're in the ghetto. Why don't the preacher give back to the community? You have no idea what that preacher do in the 24 hours of his day. A preacher's job is never done. A preacher don't preach on Sundays. He don't have an 8-hour-a-day job. A preacher's job is 24/7. Whenever you call, the preacher supposed to answer. That's his job. That's his function. And you forget about a loved one that passed away. Who do you call to pray over that loved one? Who do you call to bury that loved one? It's the preacher. You don't have to call him. You can do a burial without the preacher. But yet you call the preacher. So there's a lot of things that preachers do in the community and for black people that's forgotten. It's like the story that was told about a snake that was out in the cold, about frozen to death. And so this woman had compassion on this snake that was at the edge of life. And so she took the snake in. She put a blanket around the snake to keep him warm. She fed the snake. She pampered the snake. And she nursed the snake back into good health. At the end of the day, the snake did what snakes do. That snake bit her. And she was puzzled as to why did the snake bite her. And she said, Mr. Snake, I took you in when you were at the point of death. I kept you warm. I fed you. I nursed you into good health. Why, Mr. Snake, did you bite me? And the snake replied, didn't you know that I was a snake when you first picked me up? And see, that's the way it is with a lot of black people that were found half dead in the street. Not physically dead, but you were separated from the Most High. You were nowhere near the path of a spiritual journey or even righteousness. But because the preacher was there with his outreach ministry and nursed you back into good health, then the devil comes and whispers in your ear and feed your mind everything negative about that preacher, and you turn your back on him. You become that snake that bit that woman that nursed it into good health. So the forgotten hero in the black community is the black preacher. Yes, there are wolves in sheep clothing, but I've seen even those wolves do good things in the black community. So I just thought that I enlighten you with that information, because I get tired of hearing the black church or the black pastors or preachers being bashed by their own people. And these are the same people that your mama and your grandmama and even your fathers went to church, said their prayers when you were lost and out in the street. And in many cases, it was that black preacher that came and got you out of your condition. Where would you be today had it not been for that black preacher, that forgotten hero in the black community? So feedback, tell me what you think. Until next time, I'm fearless.